A waitress gives a free meal to a cashless tourist, never expecting to see him again. But what she doesn't know? He's a billionaire in disguise, searching for someone who loves him, not his fortune. Drawn to her kindness, he returns, pretending to be just another traveler. Their connection deepens, but so does his secret. When the truth is exposed in the worst way possible, her world shatters. Was their love ever real? Or was she just another pawn in a billionaire's game? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Rain drummed against the windows of the seaside diner, a relentless symphony that had persisted since dawn. Neely Winters wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, her movements mechanical as she glanced at the nearly empty restaurant. The coastal town's tourism season was winding down, and the miserable weather wasn't helping business. "Order up, Neely," Charlie the cook called from the kitchen window. She tucked a stray strand of honey-brown hair back into her ponytail and grabbed the plate of fish and chips. As she delivered it to the elderly couple in the corner booth, her smile remained genuine despite the worries weighing on her mind. "Can I get you folks anything else?" she asked. "No, dear, this looks wonderful," the woman replied. Neely nodded and returned to the counter, surreptitiously checking her phone. Another missed call from the bank. Her stomach tightened. The loan for renovating her grandmother's bakery seemed further out of reach with each passing day. The bell above the door jingled, and Neely looked up to see a man step inside, rainwater cascading from his dark jacket. He shook his head slightly, droplets flying from his hair, and Neely couldn't help but notice how handsome he was, tall with warm eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners when he caught her staring. "Nasty out there," he said with a rueful smile. "Been like this all day," Neely replied, grabbing a menu. "Sit anywhere you like." He chose a stool at the counter, directly across from where she stood. Up close, Neely noticed the quality of his clothes, simple but expensive, though he carried himself without pretension. "Just passing through?" she asked, pouring him coffee without being asked. Most locals preferred tea in this weather. "Something like that." He wrapped his hands around the mug gratefully. "I'm Gabriel Blackwood." "Neely Winters," she responded, surprising herself with the introduction. She didn't usually share her name so readily with tourists. "The special today is clam chowder, perfect for weather like this." "Sold," he said, his smile widening. "And some of that apple pie in the case, if it's homemade." "It is. My grandmother's recipe, actually." For the next 30 minutes, Neely found herself returning to Gabriel's end of the counter between serving other customers. Their conversation flowed easily, about the town, the storm. Nothing too personal, yet somehow more meaningful than small talk. There was something in his eyes, a genuine interest when she spoke that made her feel truly seen. When she brought his check, Gabriel reached for his back pocket and froze. His hand patted his other pockets with increasing urgency. "Everything okay?" Neely asked. "My wallet." His face flushed with embarrassment. "I must have left it at the hotel. Or maybe—" He glanced toward the door, remembering his dash through the downpour. Neely saw the mortification in his eyes and made a split-second decision. "Don't worry about it. I can't just—" "It's covered," she said firmly, already pulling money from her own wallet beneath the counter. "That's incredibly kind, but I can't let you do that," Gabriel protested. "Consider it coastal hospitality." Neely slipped her own 20 into the register. "Just come back sometime." Gabriel studied her face, searching for any sign of resentment or calculation, finding only genuine kindness. Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to curiosity, then warmth. "I will," he promised, his voice softer. "Thank you, Neely. Truly." As he left, Neely watched him disappear into the rain, wondering why she'd done something so impulsive. That $20 was part of her savings, money she couldn't really spare. Yet she didn't regret it. In his luxury hotel suite, Gabriel Blackwood stood by the window, watching the storm rage over the ocean. His fingers traced the edges of the small business card he'd taken from the diner's counter. The seaside diner, with its faded blue awning and chipped mugs, was worlds away from the five-star restaurants and exclusive clubs he usually frequented. And Neely Winters, with her honest smile and impulsive generosity, was nothing like the people who typically surrounded him. After his very public breakup with Claudia, a model who'd been more interested in his bank account than his company, Gabriel had escaped to this small coastal town seeking anonymity. He'd left his entourage behind, dressed down his wardrobe, and told no one where he was going. For once, he wanted to be just Gabriel, not Gabriel Blackwood, billionaire hotel developer. He set the business card on the nightstand and made a decision. He would go back tomorrow, pay Neely back, and perhaps see where things might lead. But he wouldn't reveal who he really was. Not yet. For once, he wanted someone to see him, not his wealth. 3 days later, the bell above the diner door jingled, and Neely looked up from wiping down the counter. Her heart skipped when she saw Gabriel standing there, this time dry and carrying a professional-looking camera bag slung over his shoulder. "You came back," she said, unable to hide her smile. "I promised I would." Gabriel approached the counter, pulling out his wallet. "And I owe you for the other day." Neely waved him off. "Forget it, but I will accept you ordering something new today as payment." "Deal." He settled onto the same stool he'd occupied during his first visit. "I'm actually staying in town for a while, doing some freelance photography work along the coast." "A photographer?" Neely poured him coffee without asking. "What kind of shots are you looking for?" Gabriel's eyes lit up. "Landscapes, mostly. The interplay of light on water. Old buildings with character. Places with stories." As Neely served him lunch, they fell into easy conversation. Gabriel asked thoughtful questions about the town, genuinely interested in her answers. When other customers came in, he didn't seem to mind waiting, instead using the time to jot notes in a small leather notebook. When her shift ended at 3, Neely untied her apron and hesitated by the counter where Gabriel was finishing his coffee. "I was wondering," he said before she could speak, "if you might show me around. The tourist maps are fine, but I'd love to see this place through a local's eyes." "I'd like that," Neely replied, surprised by how much she meant it. 20 minutes later, they were walking along the shoreline, Neely pointing out landmarks while Gabriel occasionally stopped to frame a shot. The afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting golden light across the water. "My grandmother used to bring me here every Sunday after church," Neely said, as they followed a path along the bluffs. "She'd tell me stories about how the town used to be when she was young." Gabriel lowered his camera. "You mentioned her recipe at the diner. Were you close?" "She raised me after my parents moved to Arizona for work. They sent money, but Graham was my real parent." Neely's voice softened. "She taught me everything important, especially baking. She could make a pie crust so flaky it would melt in your mouth." Their hands brushed as they walked, neither pulling away. The accidental touch sent warmth spreading up Neely's arm. "What about you?" she asked. "Any family in the photography business?" Gabriel hesitated just slightly. "No, my family's more conventional, business-oriented. Photography is my escape." They rounded a corner, and Neely pointed to a weathered 2-story building with a faded sign reading Winter's Bakery. "That was hers," she said, her voice catching. "My grandmother's place. Been closed for 5 years now." Gabriel studied the building, noting its charming bay windows and Victorian details beneath years of neglect. "It's beautiful." "It's falling apart," Neely sighed. "I've been trying to save for renovations, but the bank won't approve a loan without more collateral. Some developer keeps making offers to buy the whole block." Without thinking, Gabriel reached for her hand. What would you do with it, if money wasn't an issue? Neely's eyes lit up, and she didn't pull her hand away. Restore it exactly as it was. The original ovens are still there. Graham's recipes are all I have left of her, and they deserve to be shared. Her passion was magnetic. Gabriel found himself staring at her lips as she spoke, wondering what they would taste like. They ended their tour at the pier, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Their shoulders touched as they leaned against the railing. "Thank you for today," Gabriel said softly. Could we do this again?" Neely turned to him, their faces inches apart. "I'd like that. I'm off on Sunday." "Sunday it is," he replied, fighting the urge to kiss her right there. As they walked back toward town, both felt the unmistakable pull of something new and fragile forming between them. Something neither wanted to rush, but neither could deny. Over the next 2 weeks, the coastal town witnessed the blossoming of something neither Gabriel nor Neely had anticipated. Their Sunday outing extended to Monday evening drinks, then Wednesday afternoon walks, until they found themselves seeking each other's company at every opportunity. Gabriel maintained his photographer persona with careful attention to detail. He carried his professional camera everywhere, captured genuinely beautiful images of the coastline, and spoke passionately about lighting and composition. It wasn't entirely a lie. Photography had been a serious hobby before his business empire consumed his time. On a sunny afternoon, Gabriel waited outside the diner as Neely finished her shift. Through the window, he noticed a well-dressed young man leaning against the counter, speaking to Neely with an unpleasant smirk. Her body language, crossed arms, tight shoulders, told Gabriel everything he needed to know. When Neely emerged, her smile seemed forced. "Everything okay?" Gabriel asked, taking her bag. "Just Derek being Derek," she sighed. "The owner's son. Also my ex, which he never lets me forget. Want to talk about it?" Neely shook her head. "I'd rather forget he exists. Let's go to the farmer's market instead." That evening, they carried their fresh vegetables to Nellie's small apartment above a bookstore. The space was tiny, but filled with personal touches, handmade quilts, framed photographs, and shelves lined with cookbooks. "My grandmother's collection," Neely explained, pulling one down. "Some have her notes in the margins." Gabriel ran his fingers over the handwritten annotations. "She sounds remarkable." She was. Neely pulled ingredients from bags. "Want to help me make dinner?" They moved around the small kitchen in a comfortable dance, chopping vegetables and sharing stories. Gabriel revealed his love of sailing, but carefully avoided mentioning his yacht collection. Neely described her dream of reopening the bakery with updated versions of her grandmother's recipes. "I can almost see it," she said, stirring sauce. "Morning sunlight through those bay windows, the smell of fresh bread, people gathering around tables." Gabriel watched her animated face and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't the calculated attraction he'd experienced in previous relationships. This was something honest and unexpected. 3 days later, while Neely worked, Gabriel visited the local municipal office, curious about the bakery building's status. What he discovered made his blood run cold. "Demolition scheduled next month," the clerk said, showing him the permit. "Whole block's been purchased by Sentinel Enterprises. Going to be condominiums, I hear." Gabriel stared at the document, his stomach dropping. Sentinel was his company's development subsidiary. He'd been so focused on his European hotels that he hadn't reviewed the domestic acquisition reports in months. The moment he left the building, Gabriel called his office. "This is Blackwood," he said, dropping the casual tone he used with Neely. "I need the Harborview development project in Seacliff halted immediately. Yes, the entire project. I don't care about the penalties. Just stop it." His assistant's confused voice came through the line. "Sir, may I ask why?" "I'll explain when I return. Just make it happen." That evening at the diner, Derek approached their table while Neely was in the restroom. "Enjoying our local hospitality?" he asked Gabriel, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Very much so," Gabriel replied evenly. Derek leaned closer. "Just so you know, Neely's little tourist romances never last. She'll be here when you're gone, and so will I." Gabriel met his gaze steadily. "Is there something specific you wanted to say?" "Just looking out for local interests." Derek straightened as Neely returned. "Enjoy your meal." "What did he want?" Neely asked, sliding into the booth. "To mark his territory, I think," Gabriel replied. Neely rolled her eyes. "He's been unbearable since we started spending time together, making comments about my vacation fling and how I'll regret it when you leave." Gabriel reached for her hand. "I'm not planning to leave anytime soon." The words surprised him as much as her. 2 nights later, Gabriel took Neely to the lighthouse at the point. They climbed the spiral staircase to the observation deck, where the stars spread above them in breathtaking clarity. "I've lived here my whole life," Neely whispered, "and I've never seen the stars like this." Gabriel stood behind her, hesitantly placing his hands on her shoulders. "Neely." She turned, her face tilted up to his, moonlight silvering her features. "Yes." "I'm falling for you," he said simply, "and it terrifies me." "Why?" Her voice was soft. "Because it's real. Because I didn't expect you." Neely stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. "I'm falling for you too." When their lips finally met, the lighthouse beams swept across the ocean behind them, illuminating the moment in flashes of gold. Gabriel pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, knowing he was crossing a point of no return, both with the secret he kept and the feelings he could no longer deny. The morning light streamed through Neely's apartment windows as she pulled out a worn photo album from her bookshelf. Gabriel sat beside her on the small sofa, their shoulders touching as she opened it across their laps. "This is the bakery in its heyday," she said, pointing to a faded photograph of a charming storefront with Winter's Bakery painted in elegant script across the window. "My grandmother opened it when she was just 23. Gabriel studied the image, noting the architectural details that made the building special. The curved bay windows, the ornate cornices, the welcoming entrance. In the photo, a young woman with Neely's smile stood proudly in the doorway. "You look just like her," he said softly. Neely nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. "Everyone says that." She turned the page to show more photos. The bakery's interior with its glass display cases. Customers gathered around small tables, her grandmother's hands kneading dough. "What happened to it?" Gabriel asked, though dread pooled in his stomach. He already suspected the answer. Neely's expression clouded. "After she died, there were tax problems. I was 19 and had no idea how to handle it all. A company called Sentinel Enterprises approached with an offer." She closed the album, her fingers lingering on the cover. "They said they'd preserve the building's character, maybe even keep it as a bakery space. But once the papers were signed, they just boarded it up." Gabriel swallowed hard, guilt tightening his chest. "I'm sorry," he managed. The worst part was finding out later that they paid far less than market value. The lawyer they recommended. She shook her head. "I should have gotten a second opinion, but I was grieving and overwhelmed." Gabriel's arm tightened around her shoulders. Every word was like a knife twisting in his gut. His company, his family's company, had taken advantage of her vulnerability. The thought made him sick. "I'll never stop dreaming about getting it back someday," she whispered. The next afternoon, while Neely worked at the diner, Gabriel sat in his hotel room with his laptop open, using his executive access codes to search through Sentinel's acquisition records. What he found disturbed him deeply. The bakery had been part of a block-wide purchase, but unlike the other properties, Its file contained unusual addendums and price adjustments. The lawyer who had represented Neely was listed as a regular consultant for Sentinel, a clear conflict of interest. Most concerning was an internal memo suggesting they had deliberately targeted the property after learning of the owner's death, knowing the inexperienced granddaughter would be easy to manipulate. Gabriel closed his laptop, a cold anger settling over him. This wasn't just business. It was predatory, and it had happened under his watch, while he'd been focused on European expansions and luxury hotel openings. At the diner, Derek watched from behind the counter as Neely laughed at something on her phone. Undoubtedly a message from her photographer boyfriend. His jaw tightened as he slipped into the office, quickly transferring another $500 from the diner's digital account to his personal one. His father never checked the books anymore, making it easy to skim enough to maintain his lifestyle. He paused when he heard Neely's voice outside the door, quickly closing the accounting program and pretending to organize receipts. "Hey," she said, poking her head in. "I'm heading out. My shift's over." "Hot date?" he asked with a forced smile. "Just meeting Gabriel at the beach. Lisa and Mark are joining us for a bonfire." Derek nodded, hiding his irritation. Her friends had already accepted the outsider into their circle. "Have fun," he said flatly, watching her leave. The weekend brought a rare, perfect evening. Neely introduced Gabriel to her small group of friends around a beach bonfire. Lisa, her best friend since childhood, pulled Gabriel aside while Neely was deep in conversation with others. "I haven't seen her this happy in years," Lisa said, watching Neely laugh. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Gabriel nodded, warmed by the approval but haunted by his deception. "She's special," he said simply. Later that night in Neely's apartment, she tied an apron around her waist and pulled out ingredients: flour, sugar, cinnamon, and a small bottle of vanilla extract. "My grandmother's special recipe," she explained, measuring flour into a bowl. She called them memory cookies, because she said one bite would create a memory you'd never forget. Gabriel watched her work, mesmerized by the confident movements of her hands as she mixed and folded the dough. When she offered him a spoon to taste, their eyes met over the batter. "Here," she said softly. "Tell me what you think." The flavor was perfect, sweet with hints of cinnamon and something else he couldn't identify. But it was the look in her eyes that undid him, trusting, open, loving. "It's wonderful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. When the cookies emerged from the oven, golden and fragrant, they sat at her small kitchen table and shared them with glasses of cold milk. Neely told stories of baking with her grandmother, laughing through tears as memories surfaced. Gabriel reached across the table to take her hand, overwhelmed by the simple intimacy of the moment and the weight of his growing feelings. The cookies, the stories, the trust in her eyes, all of it created something more powerful than any connection he'd ever known. And all of it built on a lie he was finding increasingly unbearable to maintain. Gabriel's phone vibrated against the nightstand, jolting him awake. The hotel room was still dark, dawn barely breaking through the curtains. He squinted at the screen. Vivian. His stomach tightened as he answered. "Gabriel, finally. Do you know how many messages I've left?" Her crisp voice held no room for pleasantries. He sat up, instantly alert. "It's 5 in the morning, Vivian. And I've been up since 4 handling the Singapore deal you should be overseeing." Papers rustled in the background. "The board is getting restless about your extended vacation. I'm flying in tomorrow to get the Oceanside development back on track." Gabriel's heart pounded. "That's not necessary." "It absolutely is. The demolition permits for that old block have been mysteriously delayed. Someone's been interfering with the process." Her tone made it clear she knew exactly who. "I've scheduled meetings with the local officials to fast-track everything." Cold dread washed over him. "Vivian, I've been looking into that property. There were irregularities with how we acquired." "Save it for tomorrow. I'll be at the Harborview Hotel by noon." "And Gabriel?" This little identity crisis of yours ends now. If you don't show up, I'll find your waitress myself and explain exactly who's been lying to her." The line went dead. Gabriel stared at his phone, panic rising in his chest. That afternoon, Neely noticed Gabriel's distraction immediately. His eyes kept drifting to his phone, his responses delayed by seconds. "Is everything okay?" she asked as they walked along the harbor. He forced a smile. "Just some work issues. A client needs photos rushed." The lie tasted bitter. "But I'd rather focus on you." She nodded, but he caught the flicker of doubt in her eyes. It stung worse than Vivian's threats. "Actually," he said, making a sudden decision, "are you free tomorrow afternoon? I'd like to take you somewhere special." Her smile returned, though not quite reaching her eyes. "I can swap shifts with Lisa." "Perfect." He squeezed her hand, determined to make it count. It might be their last normal day together. The next morning, Gabriel woke early to prepare. He drove to the gourmet market 2 towns over, selecting cheeses, fresh bread, and local fruits. He found a bottle of sparkling cider, remembering Neely mentioning she didn't drink alcohol. Each item was chosen with care, a silent apology for what he couldn't yet say. He picked her up at noon, driving them to a secluded overlook with a view of the entire coastline. Neely gasped when she saw the picnic he'd arranged on a blanket beneath a sprawling oak tree. "Gabriel, this is beautiful." They settled on the blanket, the ocean spread before them like a painting. For a while, they ate and talked, and Gabriel found himself sharing more truth than he had before. Stories of his childhood, his passion for architecture before photography, his parents' expectations. He carefully omitted details that would reveal his wealth, but the emotions were genuine. "I've never told anyone some of these things," he admitted. Nelly's fingers intertwined with his. "Thank you for trusting me." Guilt twisted in his chest. If only she knew how much he was still hiding. They were packing up when Neely's phone chimed. She frowned at the message. "It's Lisa. There's a problem at the diner. Derek's on a rampage." They arrived to find the elderly cook, Martha, in tears, while Derek berated her in front of customers. 50 years in kitchens and you can't follow a simple inventory system. Derek's face was flushed with anger. "This is why this place is failing. Incompetent staff who can't adapt." Martha's hands trembled as she tried to explain. "The new system doesn't account for—" "I don't want excuses from someone who should have retired a decade ago." Neely stepped forward, placing herself between them. "That's enough, Derek. Stay out of this, Neely. It's not your business. It is when you're humiliating someone who's worked here longer than you've been alive." Her voice was steady, though Gabriel could see her hands shaking. "Martha taught you how to flip pancakes, remember? She deserves your respect." Derek's eyes narrowed. "Careful, your job isn't exactly secure." "Then fire me." Neely lifted her chin. "But you know your father would have something to say about that, especially when he hears how you're treating Martha." The diner had gone silent, all eyes on them. Derek glanced around, realizing his audience. With a scoff, he retreated to the office, slamming the door. Neely immediately turned to Martha, guiding her to a chair and getting her water. The older woman patted Neely's hand gratefully. Gabriel watched, a powerful emotion swelling in his chest. Neely had everything to lose: her job, her income, her stability. Yet she'd stood firm against injustice without hesitation. In that moment, his resolve crystallized. He would find a way to protect her dreams, to make things right about the bakery, and somehow tell her the truth without losing her. He had to. People like Nelly were too rare to lose. The morning sun glinted off the polished glass of the harborside cafe. Gabriel sat at an outdoor table, cap pulled low, sipping coffee while checking his phone. He'd hoped to meet Vivian somewhere less public, but she'd insisted on this spot. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Gabriel's shoulders tensed as Vivian emerged, her tailored navy suit and perfect posture immediately setting her apart from the casual tourists strolling the boardwalk. Her eyes scanned the cafe, landing on him with laser precision. A small, knowing smile curved her lips as she approached. "So this is what a billionaire in hiding looks like," she said, taking the seat across from him. "Quite the method acting, Gabriel." He glanced around nervously. "Keep your voice down, please. Relax, no one's paying attention." She signaled for a waiter. "Though I must say, I hardly recognized you without Armani. The beard is interesting." Gabriel ran a hand over his 2-week stubble. "What are you doing here, Vivian? I told you I'd handle things." "You've been handling things for nearly a month." She ordered an espresso without looking at the menu. "The Boston investors are getting impatient. We need to break ground on the waterfront project by next month. I'm working on an alternative plan. The bakery building has historical significance that we overlooked." Vivian's perfectly shaped eyebrow arched. "Since when do you care about small-town historical preservation? This isn't like you." "Maybe it should be." Gabriel leaned forward. "Look, I just need more time. We can reconfigure the development to incorporate the existing structure. That would cost millions more and delay completion by months." She studied him, her expression softening slightly. "Gabriel, what's really going on? Is this about a woman?" He looked away, his silence answering for him. "Oh, Gabriel." Vivian sighed. "Not again. Remember what happened with Claudia? This is different. Neely is nothing like Claudia. They never are, until they are." She took a sip of her espresso. "I'm having lunch at that quaint diner you've been frequenting. Perhaps I'll meet this special someone." Gabriel's face paled. "Vivian, don't. Relax. I'll be discreet." She gathered her purse. "But the development moves forward. You have 3 days to come back to reality, or I'll handle things myself." Derek watched the exchange from his car parked across the street. The woman in the power suit looked important, and Gabriel seemed uncomfortable. Definitely not the behavior of a simple photographer. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through the photos he'd taken of Gabriel over the past week. Something about the guy had always seemed off, too polished, too confident for a freelancer passing through town. "Let's see who you really are," Derek muttered, cropping one of the clearer images and starting a reverse image search. The lunch rush at the diner was in full swing when Vivian walked in. Neely greeted her with a professional smile, leading her to a corner booth. "Our special today is clam chowder in a sourdough bread bowl," Neely said, handing her a menu. "Just a Cobb salad dressing on the side," Vivian replied, her eyes scanning the quaint interior with thinly veiled judgment. "And sparkling water if you have it. We have bottled seltzer." "That will do." As Neely turned to place the order, Vivian called after her. "You're Neely, correct? I've heard about you." Neely paused. "I'm sorry, have we met?" "No, but we have a mutual acquaintance, Gabriel Blackwood." Neely's expression brightened. "You know Gabriel?" "For many years." Vivian's smile was calculated. "His photography really is transformative, wouldn't you say?" "It is. He has a unique perspective." "Indeed. He sees potential where others might miss it." Vivian glanced meaningfully around the diner. "Though I've always thought his true talent lies elsewhere." Throughout the meal, Neely couldn't help noticing the woman's designer watch, her perfect manicure, the way she spoke on her phone in brief, commanding sentences about acquisition projections and development timelines. She seemed to belong to a world Neely had only glimpsed in magazines, a world Gabriel had somehow known but never mentioned. That evening, Gabriel rented a small motorboat, guiding it into the bay as sunset painted the sky in fiery oranges and pinks. Neely sat across from him, quieter than usual. "Everything okay?" he asked, cutting the engine as they drifted in the calm waters. "I met your friend today, Vivian." Gabriel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "She's a business associate, not really a friend." "She seemed to know you well." Nayli looked out at the horizon. "She made me realize how little I actually know about you." The boat rocked gently as Gabriel moved to sit beside her. "Ask me anything. I want you to know me." Under the emerging stars, they talked. Gabriel shared his fear of never being loved for himself rather than what he could provide. Nayli admitted her terror of being stuck forever, watching her dreams fade like her grandmother's bakery. "I'm afraid of disappointment," she whispered, her head against his shoulder. "Of believing in something that turns out to be an illusion." Gabriel's heart hammered in his chest. "Nayli, there's something I need to tell you." His phone buzzed, a text from Vivian. "Decision time. Tomorrow noon." He silenced the phone, turning back to Nayli. The moonlight silvered her face, and he couldn't bring himself to shatter this moment. Derek stared at his computer screen, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. The search results displayed several photos of Gabriel Blackwood, CEO of Sentinel Enterprises, cutting ribbons at hotel openings, shaking hands with mayors and governors. Next to these images was a business news article. Sentinel Enterprises acquires waterfront properties in coastal Maine. Major development planned. Well, Derek murmured, saving the images to a folder. "Looks like our photographer friend has been playing pretend." He glanced at the bakery deed documents he'd pulled from his father's files, his mind racing with possibilities. This information was leverage, powerful leverage, and Derek knew exactly how to use it. The morning after their boat ride, Gabriel was reviewing development alternatives on his laptop when a sharp knock interrupted his concentration. He opened his hotel room door to find Derek leaning against the doorframe, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Derek said, emphasizing the name with obvious satisfaction. "Or do you prefer Gabriel the photographer around here?" Gabriel's stomach dropped. He glanced down the hallway before pulling Derek inside and shutting the door. "What do you want?" Derek sauntered around the modest hotel room, eyeing the open laptop with financial projections visible on screen. Interesting choice of accommodations for a billionaire, slumming it to impress the locals? "I asked what you want," Gabriel repeated, his voice hardening. "It's simple." Derek dropped into an armchair, making himself comfortable. "I know who you really are. CEO of Sentinel Enterprises, the company that's about to bulldoze half the waterfront, including Nayli's precious bakery." He pulled out his phone, showing Gabriel the articles and photos he'd found. "I wonder how Nayli would feel knowing she's been sleeping with the enemy." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "We're not—" Details. Derek waved dismissively. "The point is, your little masquerade ends when I tell her the truth. Unless ... Unless what?" $20,000 cash. Today." Derek smiled. "Consider it a small investment in your romantic happiness." Gabriel stared at him in disbelief. "That's extortion." "I prefer to think of it as an opportunity for mutual benefit. You keep your secret. I solve some financial challenges." Derek stood, straightening his jacket. "I'll meet you behind the diner at closing. 6 o'clock. After Derek left, Gabriel sank onto the bed, head in his hands. The walls of his deception were closing in. He'd meant to tell Nayli the truth on the boat last night, had been seconds away from confession when Vivian's text arrived. Now Derek had weaponized his secret. That evening, Gabriel handed over an envelope of cash in the alley behind the diner, disgust evident on his face. "Smart choice," Derek said, thumbing through the bills. "But don't get too comfortable. I might need additional consultations in the future." Gabriel grabbed Derek's wrist. "This is it. We're done." Derek yanked his arm free. "We're done when I say we're done. Remember, one phone call to Nayli and your little romance implodes." Gabriel watched him walk away, the weight of his choices pressing down like a physical burden. He needed to tell Nayli the truth himself. But first, he had to find a way to protect her from both Derek and Sentinel's development plans. The coastal town's summer festival transformed the main street into a fairyland of twinkling lights and colorful booths. Local vendors sold handcrafted items while a band played on a small stage at the town square. Neely wore a simple sundress that caught the breeze as she pulled Gabriel toward the dance area. "Come on, I love this song." Despite the blackmail hanging over him, Gabriel couldn't help smiling at her enthusiasm. When she stepped into his arms, swaying to the music beneath strings of golden lights, everything else momentarily faded away. "You seem distracted tonight," she said, searching his face. "Is everything okay?" Gabriel tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Just thinking about how lucky I am to be here with you." "But something's bothering you." Her fingers traced the worry lines on his forehead. "You can tell me anything you know." The music slowed, and he pulled her closer. "Neely, there's something I need to tell you. Something important about who I really..." His phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. Vivian's name flashed on the screen. 3 missed calls already. "I'm sorry," he said, reluctantly stepping back. "I have to take this." Neely nodded, disappointment flashing across her face. "Go ahead, I'll get us some lemonade." Gabriel moved to a quieter spot near the harbor. "This better be important, Vivian." "The board is voting tomorrow on the coastal development," she said without preamble. "They're accelerating the timeline. Demolition permits are being processed as we speak." "What? That's impossible. I ordered a hold on the project." "Your absence created a vacuum. Jenkins convinced enough board members that delay means lost revenue." Her voice turned accusatory. "This is what happens when you disappear to play small-town romance." Gabriel watched Neely at the lemonade stand, laughing with the elderly vendor. "Stall them. I need more time." "Time for what, Gabriel?" "To tell your waitress girlfriend you're the man behind the company destroying her grandmother's building. Or to come to your senses and remember who you really are." After ending the call, Gabriel stood at the harbor's edge, watching boats gently bobbing on moonlit water. He had to find a solution that would save both Neely's bakery and his relationship with her. The truth couldn't wait any longer. As he returned to the festival, weather reports on a nearby radio caught his attention. A severe storm system was moving up the coast, expected to hit within 48 hours. One more complication in an already impossible situation. Neely approached with 2 cups of lemonade, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Everything okay?" Gabriel took her hand, making a silent promise. He would fix this, all of it, and then tell her everything, before it was too late. The storm hit with a vengeance. Rain lashed against the diner's windows in violent sheets, while wind howled like a living thing. Despite the weather advisory, the diner was packed with locals seeking refuge and hot food. Neely darted between tables, hair escaping from her ponytail, cheeks flushed from exertion. 3 servers had called in due to flooding on their streets, leaving her and 1 elderly waitress to handle the unexpected crowd. "Order up!" The cook's voice barely carried over the storm's roar and the chattering customers. Neely grabbed 2 plates of steaming food and delivered them with a smile that masked her exhaustion. As she turned back toward the counter, the bell above the door jingled. Gabriel stood in the entrance, rain dripping from his jacket, concern etched across his face. "Neely," he navigated through the crowded tables. "What are you still doing here? The storm warning's been upgraded to severe." "We're short-staffed," she explained, wiping her hands on her apron. "I can't leave Marge alone with all these people." Gabriel glanced at the elderly waitress struggling with a heavy coffee pot. "The weather's getting worse by the minute. They're evacuating the lower streets." "Just let me finish this shift," Neely said, squeezing his arm. "People need somewhere warm and dry." Before Gabriel could argue further, his phone vibrated. Vivian's name flashed on the screen. He hesitated, then answered. "I can barely hear you," he said, pressing one finger against his ear. Vivian's voice crackled through static. "Found something. Original deed. Illegal acquisition." "What?" "Vivian, you're breaking up. Can challenge the bakery building. Proof of..." The line went dead as a particularly violent gust rattled the diner's windows. Gabriel stared at his phone, heart racing. Had Vivian found evidence that could save Neely's grandmother's building? A loud crack from above drew everyone's attention. Gabriel looked up to see a hairline fracture spreading across the ceiling, water beginning to seep through. "That doesn't look good," a customer muttered. Gabriel scanned the room with growing alarm. The old building was showing signs of stress, slight bowing in the walls, water stains spreading across the ceiling. Experience from countless construction projects told him what was coming. "Neely," he called urgently, moving toward her. "The roof..." A sharp, splintering sound cut him off as a section of ceiling near the kitchen gave way. Plaster, insulation, and water crashed down onto empty tables. "Everyone out!" Gabriel shouted. "The roof is collapsing!" Panic erupted. Customers scrambled toward the exit, knocking over chairs and tables. Neely rushed to help Marge, who stood frozen behind the counter. "This way," Gabriel directed, guiding people toward the door. "Stay calm. Keep moving." Rain poured through the growing hole in the ceiling as more cracks appeared. Gabriel counted heads as people evacuated, working with Neely to ensure everyone made it out safely. "Is that everyone?" he asked, water now soaking through his clothes. Neely's eyes widened in horror. "Mrs. Abernathy, she was in the back booth!" Before Gabriel could stop her, Neely darted toward the rear of the diner, where an elderly woman was struggling to free herself from debris that had pinned her table. "Neely, wait!" Gabriel called, racing after her as more of the ceiling began to give way. The roar of the storm grew louder as they reached Mrs. Abernathy. The ceiling above them sagged dangerously, water streaming through widening cracks. "We need to hurry," Gabriel said, lifting a fallen beam from the table. "This whole section is about to go." Together, they helped Mrs. Abernathy to her feet. The elderly woman winced, leaning heavily on Neely. "I think my ankle's twisted," she gasped. A terrible groaning sound filled the air as the remaining support beams shifted. Gabriel looked up to see the ceiling directly above them buckling. "Run!" he shouted, pushing Neely and Mrs. Abernathy forward with all his strength. In that split second, as the women stumbled toward safety, Gabriel saw the ceiling give way completely. He lunged after them, managing to shove them clear of the collapse zone. The last thing he heard was Neely screaming his name as something heavy struck his shoulder and head. Pain exploded through his body, and then darkness claimed him as tons of debris crashed down around his fallen form. Pain greeted Gabriel first, a throbbing ache that radiated from his shoulder and pulsed through his skull. He struggled to open his eyes, the harsh fluorescent lights sending sharp needles of discomfort through his head. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of monitors told him where he was before his vision cleared. "Gabriel?" Neely's voice, soft and tentative, drew his attention. She sat beside his bed, her hair disheveled, dark circles under her reddened eyes. She looked like she hadn't slept all night. "Neely," he whispered, his throat dry and scratchy. "What happened?" "The roof collapsed." Her hand found his, squeezing gently. "You pushed Mrs. Abernathy and me out of the way, but you got hit. You've been unconscious for almost 18 hours. Gabriel tried to sit up but winced as pain shot through his shoulder. "Don't move," Neely urged. "You have a concussion and a dislocated shoulder. The doctor said you were lucky it wasn't worse." Gabriel relaxed back against the pillows, studying her face. "You've been here the whole time?" Neely nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "I couldn't leave. Not after what you did." She rubbed her eyes. "I should get some coffee. Do you need anything?" "Just you," he said, squeezing her hand. She blushed slightly. "I'll be right back." As Neely disappeared through the doorway, Gabriel closed his eyes, the weight of his deception pressing down on him harder than the debris that had struck him. He had to tell her the truth, today, now, before someone else did. The click of heels against linoleum snapped his eyes open. Vivian strode into the room, followed by two men in expensive suits. "Finally awake," she said, relief evident beneath her businesslike exterior. "You had us worried, Gabriel." "Vivian," he croaked, panic rising in his chest. "What are you doing here? Who are they?" "Legal and PR," she explained, checking her watch. "We need to discuss the development project and the new information I found. The acquisition of that bakery building was questionable at best, possibly fraudulent. We can halt demolition immediately and—" "Not now," Gabriel interrupted, glancing anxiously toward the door. "Please, just give me a few minutes alone." "We don't have time for this," Vivian insisted. "The board is demanding answers, and after your disappearing act, Mr. Blackwood, CEO of Sentinel Enterprises, needs to make some decisions." The sound of a paper cup hitting the floor made everyone turn. Neely stood frozen in the doorway, coffee spreading across the white tiles at her feet, her face drained of color. "CEO?" she whispered, her eyes locked on Gabriel. "Sentinel Enterprises?" "Neely." Gabriel struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain. "I can explain." "You're Gabriel Blackwood," she said, her voice hollow. "The Gabriel Blackwood. The billionaire developer who's been buying up half the coastline." Vivian looked between them, realization dawning. "Oh, you must be the waitress Gabriel's been spending time with." "Vivian, please," Gabriel begged. "Give us a moment." But Neely was already backing away, her expression hardening from shock into betrayal. "Your company is the one trying to demolish my grandmother's bakery. You knew. All this time, you knew." "I tried to stop it," Gabriel insisted. "I was going to tell you—" "When?" Neely demanded, tears welling in her eyes. "After how many lies? After I fell completely in love with you? Was any of it real?" "All of it," Gabriel said desperately. "Everything between us was real. The only thing I lied about was my job, my money." "Your entire identity," Neely's voice broke. "You watched me struggle, worry about bills, talk about my dreams, while you could have bought that building 100 times over without blinking." Gabriel reached for the IV in his arm, ready to tear it out. "Neely, please, don't." She held up her hand, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for saving my life, but I can't do this. I can't be with someone I can't trust." She turned and walked out, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For 3 days, Gabriel called and texted without response. From his hospital bed, he left voicemail after voicemail, each more desperate than the last. "Neely, please call me back. Let me explain everything. I never meant to hurt you. What I felt, what I feel, is real. The photographer was a lie, but the man who fell in love with you wasn't." On the 4th day, against his doctor's explicit instructions, Gabriel checked himself out of the hospital. His shoulders still in a sling, head pounding with each step, he gathered his belongings with single-minded determination. "You need at least another day of observation," the nurse protested. "I need to fix something more important than my shoulder," he replied. Meanwhile, at the temporarily closed diner, Neely sat surrounded by her co-workers as they sorted through salvageable items. She'd barely spoken about Gabriel, but her red-rimmed eyes told the story. "He seemed like such a nice guy," Marge said, placing a hand on Neely's shoulder. "The way he looked at you, that wasn't fake." "He saved your life," Mrs. Abernathy added from her chair, her ankle propped up. "Rich man or not, that counts for something." Neely wiped away a tear. "He lied about everything." "Not everything," Marge corrected gently. I saw how he listened when you talked about your grandmother, how he helped that old man with his groceries, how he jumped to save you without a thought for himself. Money can't buy that kind of genuine goodness, honey." Neely stared down at her phone, at the dozens of missed calls from Gabriel. Her thumb hovered over his name, her heart at war with her pride. "I don't know if I can forgive him," she whispered. "You don't have to decide today," Marge said, "but don't throw away something real just because it didn't start the way you thought it should." Gabriel sat at his desk in his hotel suite, surrounded by stacks of papers and legal documents. His shoulder throbbed beneath the sling, and the headache that had plagued him since the accident pulsed behind his eyes. He ignored the pain, focusing instead on the documents before him. "I've got it," he murmured, carefully setting aside a yellowed contract. "This is exactly what we need." 3 days of exhaustive research had uncovered a troubling pattern in how Sentinel Enterprises had acquired properties in the coastal town years ago. The bakery building's acquisition stood out as particularly questionable. Gabriel's legal team had unearthed documents showing Neely's grandmother had been pressured to sell during a period of temporary financial distress, with tactics that bordered on predatory. "She never wanted to sell," Gabriel said to himself, reading through the notes from the original transaction. They deliberately misrepresented the terms. He carefully organized the evidence, creating a comprehensive file that established clear legal grounds for Neely to reclaim her family's property. But Gabriel wanted to do more than just return what was wrongfully taken. He began sketching plans for a culinary center that would preserve the historic character of the building while creating a space for local chefs and bakers to train, collaborate, and showcase their work. At the center of his vision was a bakery named after Neely's grandmother, with Neely herself having complete creative control. He worked through the night, ignoring his doctor's orders to rest, driven by the desperate hope of making things right. Meanwhile, across town, Neely returned to work at the diner, which had temporarily relocated to a vacant cafe space while repairs were underway at the original building. The mood was subdued as the owner, Mr. Jenkins, reviewed the insurance paperwork and financial records. "This doesn't add up," Mr. Jenkins muttered, frowning at the spreadsheets. "We're missing nearly $30,000 from the accounts." Neely looked up from restocking napkin dispensers. "That can't be right. Could it be an accounting error?" "I've gone through everything twice," Mr. Jenkins said, his expression grim. "Someone's been skimming money, and it's been happening for months." The door to the back office banged open as Derek strode in. "Dad, we need to talk about the reconstruction budget. I think we should take the insurance money and—" "Derek," Mr. Jenkins cut him off, "explain these discrepancies in the accounts you've been managing." Derek's face flushed. "What discrepancies?" "I've been keeping this place afloat while you play golf with your buddies." "Don't try to deflect," his father warned. "Money's been disappearing, and you're the only one with access to these accounts." The confrontation escalated quickly, with Derek growing increasingly defensive. Finally, when cornered with evidence, he exploded. "So what if I took some money?" "It's practically mine anyway," Derek shouted. "And don't act all high and mighty. Everyone's out for themselves. Even that billionaire boyfriend of Neely's was just playing games, pretending to be poor to get in her pants. He only helped the diner to impress her." The room fell silent. Neely stared at Derek, processing his words. "What did you just say?" she asked quietly. Derek realized his mistake too late. "Nothing. Forget it." "You knew who Gabriel really was?" Neely pressed. "And you were blackmailing him." Derek's silence was confirmation enough. Neely felt a complicated surge of emotions: anger at Derek, confusion about Gabriel, and a small, persistent voice wondering if Gabriel's feelings had been genuine all along. That evening, Neely returned to her apartment to find a cream-colored envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a handwritten letter in Gabriel's elegant script, requesting one final meeting. "I want to right 2 wrongs," the letter concluded. the deception I perpetrated, and the injustice my company committed against your family years ago. Please give me one chance to explain. I'll be waiting at your grandmother's bakery tomorrow at noon." Next day, Neely stood outside her grandmother's old bakery, her heart hammering against her ribs. The building looked worn but dignified in the pale winter light, its faded sign still visible above the boarded windows. Snowflakes had begun to drift lazily from the gray sky, dusting her shoulders as she hesitated on the sidewalk. With a deep breath, she pushed open the unlocked door. The interior was dim, illuminated only by a few battery-powered lanterns Gabriel had placed around the space. He stood in the center of the room, tension visible in the set of his shoulders. When he turned to face her, Neely noticed the sling was gone, though he still moved gingerly. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I almost didn't," Neely admitted, remaining near the door. "What is this about, Gabriel? Or is that even your real name?" "It is," he said. "Gabriel Blackwood. No more lies." He gestured to a folder on a makeshift table. "I found something you should see." Cautiously, Neely approached and opened the folder. Inside were yellowed contracts, bank statements, and legal correspondence. "Your grandmother never wanted to sell this place," Gabriel explained, standing a respectful distance away. "My company, Sentinel Enterprises, used predatory tactics to force her hand during a temporary financial hardship. They misrepresented terms, applied pressure, and essentially stole this building from your family." Neely's fingers trembled as she examined the documents. "I always suspected something wasn't right. She was so heartbroken afterward." Gabriel nodded solemnly, then reached for another document. "This is the deed to the building. I've had it transferred back to you, not as a gift, but as recognition of your rightful inheritance. It always should have been yours." Neely stared at the paper, her name clearly printed on the ownership line. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" "Because it's right," Gabriel said simply. "And because I'm selling my controlling interest in Sentinel Enterprises." "You're what?" Neely looked up, shocked. "This experience, meeting you, has shown me what truly matters in life." Snowflakes drifted in through a broken window pane, melting in his dark hair. "All my life, people have only valued me for my wealth. After my public breakup with someone who only wanted me for my money, I became cynical, distrustful. Then I met you, someone who showed kindness to a complete stranger without expecting anything in return." He stepped closer, his eyes earnest. "It doesn't excuse my deception. I should have told you the truth sooner. But I was afraid of losing the one person who seemed to care about me, not my bank account." The snow was falling more heavily now, creating a quiet cocoon around them in the abandoned bakery. "I'm not asking for anything except your forgiveness," Gabriel continued softly. "And perhaps, if you can find it in your heart, a second chance at honest love." Neely's eyes filled with tears as memories flooded back. Their walks along the shore, cooking together in her tiny kitchen, his face illuminated by starlight at the lighthouse. The connection had been real, regardless of his name or status. "I miss the man I fell in love with," she admitted quietly. "But I need time, Gabriel. This is a lot to process." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." As snowflakes continued to drift through the broken window, Neely looked around the space that had once been her grandmother's pride and joy, now hers again. Her expression softened, the first indication that her heart might be doing the same. The winter festival transformed the town square into a wonderland of twinkling lights and cheerful activity. Crystalline snowflakes drifted through the air as townsfolk gathered around fire pits and festive booths. The historic buildings surrounding the square glowed with warm light, their edges softened by winter's gentle touch. Neely carefully arranged her grandmother's special pastries, delicate almond crescents dusted with powdered sugar, on a checkered cloth at her makeshift stand. She'd spent the morning baking in her tiny apartment kitchen, following the cherished recipe from memory. Each pastry represented a step toward reclaiming her dream. "These look amazing," said her friend Maggie, adjusting the hand-painted, "Coming soon" Winter's Bakery sign they'd hung above the table. "Thanks for helping with the renovations," Neely replied, glancing toward the far end of the square where her grandmother's bakery stood. Even from this distance, she could see the new windows that had replaced the boarded-up frames. Progress was slow but steady, each small change bringing the building back to life. Her eyes drifted across the crowded square, then stopped abruptly. There, manning the community fundraising booth instead of attending the corporate gala she knew was happening in the city tonight, stood Gabriel. He wore a simple wool coat, his cheeks flushed from the cold as he cheerfully sold raffle tickets to a young family. As if sensing her gaze, Gabriel looked up. Their eyes met across the distance, and everything between them, the hurt, the healing, the hope, seemed to crystallize in that moment. He said something to the volunteer beside him and stepped away from the booth. Neely found herself moving toward him too, as if drawn by an invisible thread. They met in the center of the square, snowflakes catching in their hair and eyelashes. "You're here," Gabriel said softly. "I thought you might be busy with bakery preparations." "I wanted to bring these," Neely gestured toward her stand. "My grandmother's recipe, the first batch from what will eventually be Winter's Bakery." "I'd love to try one," Gabriel said, his smile gentle but cautious. They walked together toward her booth, where Neely handed him one of the pastries. As he took a bite, his eyes closed appreciatively. "These are incredible," he said. "Your grandmother would be proud." Neely took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking a lot about second chances," she said, "and true connections. They're rare enough that maybe they're worth fighting for." Hope flickered in Gabriel's eyes. "Despite everything?" "Despite the deception, I believe in the person I came to know," Neely said. "The man who risked his life during the storm, who righted a wrong from the past, who's standing at a community booth tonight instead of at some fancy gala. Complete honesty from now on," Gabriel promised. "Always." They continued walking through the festival, their hands finding each other naturally. Snowflakes danced around them as they stopped beneath an archway draped with twinkling lights. "I've missed you," Gabriel whispered. Neely reached up to touch his face. "I've missed you too." When their lips met, the kiss felt like both a beginning and a homecoming, a promise of something authentic and true. "The bakery's grand opening is scheduled for spring," Neely said as they parted. "I could use a partner who knows something about business plans." Gabriel's smile brightened. "Partners. I like the sound of that." Standing there as equals, they began making plans for the future, one built on authenticity, where Neely finally allowed herself to believe in both Gabriel's love and her own dreams. If you enjoyed this story, I've found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how heartwarming and moving it is. Click on the video in front. If you enjoyed this story, I've found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how heartwarming and moving it is. Click on the video in front of you to experience this beautiful story before it's gone.